The judge's gavel hung in the air. 3 orphan girls held their breath, waiting to hear if they would be torn from the only father they'd ever known and sent back to hell. Benjamin Crawford had saved them from a killing blizzard, but saving them from the law would be harder than any battle he'd fought in the war. It had all started 6 weeks earlier, on the worst night Wyoming had seen in 20 years. The wind howled like a wounded animal across the Wyoming plains, driving snow so thick that Benjamin Crawford could barely see his horse's ears. He had been a cowboy for 32 years, survived droughts, stampedes, and more blizzards than he could count. But something about this storm felt different. It felt malicious. It felt like it had come with a purpose. He was 3 miles from his ranch checking the northern fence line before the full fury of the storm hit. The year was 1889, and December in Wyoming was as unforgiving as the war he had left behind 24 years ago. When his horse Thunder suddenly stopped and refused to move forward, Ben had learned long ago to trust his animals. So he dismounted his boots, sinking into snow already knee-deep. That is when he heard it. A sound so faint he thought he had imagined it at first. A whimper, a child's cry carried on the wind. His heart seized in his chest. Out here in this it was impossible. The nearest town was 15 miles away, and no one in their right mind would be traveling in this weather. He trudged forward, leading Thunder following that ghostly sound through the white chaos. Then he saw them. 3 small shapes huddled against a fallen cottonwood tree, nearly buried in the snow. Children. 3 little girls. The oldest couldn't have been more than 12, clutching her 2 younger sisters against her body, with a desperation that spoke of hours, maybe days of struggle. They wore nothing but thin cotton dresses, no coats, no proper shoes. Their lips were blue. Their skin was deathly pale. The oldest girl's eyes fluttered open as Ben dropped to his knees beside them. Those eyes. He would never forget those eyes. So full of fear and exhaustion and something else. Relief, maybe. Or resignation. Like she had been waiting for death and found something else instead. Ben didn't waste time with questions. He pulled the wool blanket from his saddle and wrapped it around all 3 girls, then lifted the smallest one, who couldn't have been more than 4. She was light as a bird, her tiny body trembling uncontrollably in his arms. He had to make a choice, and he had to make it fast. His ranch was closer than town. 3 miles versus 15. But could these children survive even that short journey? The oldest girl tried to speak, her voice barely a whisper, but Ben stopped her. "Save your strength, sweetheart. I'm getting you somewhere warm." He placed the youngest in front of his saddle, then lifted the middle child, maybe 6 or 7, and positioned her behind him. But when he reached for the oldest girl, she couldn't stand. Her legs had given out. Ben's throat tightened with fear. He was a big man, but Thunder was already carrying 2 children and would have to carry him through deep snow. Still, he had no choice. He lifted the oldest girl into his arms, settled into the saddle with all 3 children pressed against him, and turned Thunder toward home. The journey that normally took 20 minutes stretched into an agonizing hour. Ben talked to the girls the whole way, keeping them conscious, telling them about his ranch, about his warm fireplace, about the hot soup his housekeeper Maggie would have waiting. The youngest had stopped shivering, which terrified him. That was a bad sign. Hypothermia's final stage, when the body gave up fighting. The middle girl wept silently against his back, her small hands gripping his coat. But the oldest, the brave oldest girl, she stayed alert, her arms wrapped around her littlest sister, still trying to protect her, even as her own body failed. When Ben finally saw the lights of his ranch house through the snow, he nearly wept with relief. He shouted for Maggie before he even dismounted, and she came running. A small, fierce woman of 43 with gray-streaked hair and eyes that had seen their share of hardship. She knew crisis when she saw it. Together they carried the girls inside, peeling off their frozen clothes with careful hands, wrapping them in warm blankets, placing them by the fire. Maggie prepared warm water, not too hot to slowly raise their body temperature. She made broth while Ben rubbed life back into their frozen fingers and toes. The youngest girl began to cry, which was good. It meant she was coming back. The middle girl drank the broth greedily, spilling it down her chin. But the oldest girl, she just watched Ben with those ancient eyes that had seen too much for someone so young. As feeling returned to her limbs, the pain must have been excruciating, but she barely made a sound. Instead, she reached out and gripped Ben's calloused hand with surprising strength. The blizzard raged outside, shaking the windows, howling like all the demons of hell were demanding entry. But inside the ranch house, 3 small lives hung in the balance. Ben sat with them through the night, keeping watch, stoking the fire, praying to a God he wasn't sure he still believed in. And as dawn approached, as the storm finally began to quiet, the oldest girl pulled him close and whispered words that would haunt him forever. "Please, please don't let them send us back." Ben's blood ran cold. Back where? Who were these children running from? But the oldest girl, who would later tell him her name was Rachel, began to speak in fragments, her words tumbling out like she had been holding them in for too long. Like a dam finally breaking. The orphanage. They said we were being adopted. A nice family, they said. But when we got there, it wasn't a family. It was a work farm. They barely fed us. They locked us in the barn at night. My little sisters were so hungry, always crying from hunger. I tried to steal bread and he caught me. He said he would teach me a lesson. He said he would separate us, send my sisters away where I would never find them. Her voice cracked, fracturing like ice. So we ran. We ran during the storm because I knew he wouldn't follow in this weather. I thought we could make it to town. But the storm got worse, and Emma, she couldn't walk anymore. Her shoes had holes and her feet were bleeding. Rachel's tears came then hot against Ben's shirt as he held her. I tried to keep them warm. I tried so hard. I thought we were going to die. I was ready to die, but not them. Please God, not my little sisters. Ben's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. Maggie stood in the doorway, her own eyes glistening with tears, her hand pressed to her mouth. The 2 younger girls, Emma and little Rose, had fallen into an exhausted sleep by the fire, their breathing finally steady and strong. They would survive. They would all survive, at least physically. But Ben knew that some wounds went deeper than cold and hunger. He knelt beside Rachel, this fierce, brave child who had shielded her sisters with her own body, who had led them through a killing blizzard on nothing but love and desperation. He took both her hands in his. "I promise you on my life, you are never going back there. None of you are. You hear me? You're safe now." But Rachel shook her head, her face crumpling. "You don't understand. They have papers, legal papers. The orphanage placed us there. If they find us, we have to go back. That's the law." Ben stood up, his mind already racing. He had fought in the war, built a ranch from nothing, survived loss and loneliness and every hardship the frontier could throw at him. He would be damned if he let these 3 little girls be dragged back into hell because of paperwork. What Ben Crawford didn't know yet was that the battle to keep these 3 girls would be harder than any fight he had ever faced. And this time, the enemy wasn't bullets and bayonets. It was the law itself. Over the next few days, as the children recovered their strength, Ben learned their full story. Rachel was 12, the oldest, and she remembered everything. Their mother had died of tuberculosis in 1886. Their father, a miner named James Patterson, had tried to keep the family together, but he died in a mine collapse the following year. Rachel had been 10 when she became mother to 7-year-old Emma and 4-year-old Rose. Their uncle, their father's brother, had promised to care for them. For 3 months he tried, but money was tight, and 3 more mouths to feed was 3 too many. He took them to the Mercy Home Orphanage in Cheyenne, promised them it was temporary, and never came back. For 2 years, Rachel kept her sisters close at Mercy Home. It was crowded and underfunded, but it was safe. Until 6 months ago, when a man named Walter Garrett came offering to take in children to work his farm. The desperate administrators called it adoption, and thanked God for 1 less mouth to feed. No one checked on the children afterward. No one cared. As Rachel told the story, Ben listened with growing rage, but he kept his face calm, his voice steady. He had learned in the war that fury without control was useless. He needed to think clearly. On the second morning after the rescue, Ben saddled Thunder and rode to town, despite the snow still piled high on the trails. He needed to speak with Thomas Webb, the only lawyer in Pine Ridge, and a man who owed him a favor. A big favor. Ben had saved Webb's life during the war at Appomattox, pulling him from beneath a collapsed wagon as Confederate artillery rained down around them. Webb had never forgotten. The lawyer's office was a small room above the general store, heated by a pot-bellied stove and smelling of old paper and tobacco. Webb stood when Ben entered, his hand extended in greeting. He was 40 years old, lean and sharp-eyed, with the kind of mind that could find loopholes in ironclad contracts. Ben. Good to see you. What brings you out in this weather? Ben told him everything. Webb listened without interrupting, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. When Ben finished, the lawyer was quiet for a long moment. Finally, Webb spoke. This is complicated, Ben. The children are legally wards of Mercy Home Orphanage. Eleanor Ashford runs that place, and she has connections all the way to the state capitol. If she wants those children back, the law is on her side. I don't care about the law, Ben said quietly. I care about 3 little girls who nearly froze to death running from a man who beat them and starved them. Webb nodded slowly. I understand, and I'll help you. But you need to understand what we're up against. You're a single man, 51 years old, living 15 miles from town. The courts prefer married couples for adoption, preferably young ones with experience raising children. You have none of those advantages. Ben's hands tightened on his hat. So what do I do? Webb stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered street. First, we document everything. I'll contact Sheriff Miller and have him investigate this Garrett farm. If we can prove abuse, we can at least keep the children from being sent back there. Second, you file for adoption. It's a long shot, but it's better than nothing. He turned back to Ben. And third, you prepare for a fight, because Eleanor Ashford doesn't lose gracefully. The sheriff came to Ben's ranch that afternoon, a big man named Frank Miller, who had also served in the war and knew Ben's character. Miller interviewed Rachel, gently took notes on her account, photographed the bruises still visible on her back, the scars on Emma's feet where her shoes had rubbed her raw. 3 days later, Miller and Webb rode out to Walter Garrett's farm. What they found there made even the hardened sheriff's stomach turn. 5 other children still lived on the property, ranging in age from 6 to 13. They were housed in a converted barn with no heat, given scraps to eat, worked from dawn to dusk in conditions that would have been illegal for adult laborers. Garrett was arrested on the spot. The 5 children were removed and taken temporarily back to Mercy Home. But that left Rachel, Emma, and Rose in a legal limbo. They were safe at Ben's ranch, but for how long? The answer came 4 days after the rescue, when a black carriage pulled up to Ben's ranch in the late afternoon. A woman stepped out, tall and thin, dressed in expensive clothes that seemed out of place in the Wyoming wilderness. Eleanor Ashford had come to collect her property. Ben met her at the door. Maggie stood behind him, one hand on Rachel's shoulder. The 3 girls clustered together, fear evident in their eyes. Mr. Crawford Ashford said, her voice cold and precise, I appreciate your rescue of these children during the storm. Truly, it was heroic. But now it's time for them to come home. Home. Ben's voice was quiet, controlled. You sent them to hell and called it a home. Ashford's expression didn't change. I have already dismissed the staff member responsible for placing children with Mr. Garrett without proper oversight. It was an unfortunate error. But Mercy Home is still the legal guardian of these children, and I am here to take them back. Rachel made a small sound of distress. Emma began to cry. Little Rose clung to Maggie's skirt. Please, Rachel said, her voice breaking, please don't let her take us. Before Ben could respond, another horse appeared on the horizon. Thomas Webb rode up fast, dismounted, and approached with purpose. Mrs. Ashford Webb said formally, Mr. Crawford is filing for adoption of all 3 children. According to territorial law, he has the right to petition the court. Ashford turned her cold gaze on the lawyer. An adoption petition, from a single man of advanced age living in isolation, the court will deny it within a day. Perhaps Webb said calmly, but until they do, the children remain where they are. Ashford's lips thinned. "Very well. I will give you 45 days as the law requires. But at the end of that time, when the court rejects your petition, these children will return to Mercy Home. And Mr. Crawford, I strongly suggest you do not grow too attached." She climbed back into her carriage and departed, leaving a wake of cold silence behind her. That night, after the girls had gone to bed, Ben sat by the fire with Maggie. They had worked together for 4 years, ever since Ben had hired her as his housekeeper after she lost her husband to a mining accident. Maggie understood grief. She understood silence. And she understood when something needed to be said. "You're going to fight for them," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, even though you'll probably lose." Ben stared into the flames. "Especially because I'll probably lose. Those girls have lost everything. Parents' home safety. I won't let them lose hope too." Maggie was quiet for a moment. Then she spoke words that would change everything. "You need a wife, Ben. Pastor Helen Grant came by yesterday while you were in town. She said the same thing Webb did. The courts favor married couples. If you want a real chance at this, you need to present yourself as a complete family." Ben looked at her sharply. "I'm not asking you to do that, Maggie. I know, but I'm offering anyway." The fire crackled between them. "This wouldn't be real," Ben said carefully. "Just on paper. To help the girls." Maggie's eyes were sad and kind. "Ben, I lost my son to the river 5 years ago. He was 10 years old and I couldn't save him. I have lived with that guilt every day since. Those 3 girls upstairs need a mother, and I need to be able to save someone." She reached across and took his hand. "This is real enough for me." 3 days later, Ben and Maggie were married in the small church in Pine Ridge with only Pastor Helen Sheriff Miller and Webb as witnesses. The 3 girls wore new dresses that Maggie had sewn by hand. Ben wore his only suit, the one he had worn to his first wife's funeral 8 years ago, when Pastor Helen asked if they would love and honor each other both. Ben and Maggie said yes, and perhaps it was meant to be just words on paper, just a legal arrangement. But when little Rose asked afterward if Miss Maggie was now her mother, and Maggie knelt down with tears streaming down her face and said, "Yes, if you'll have me," something real began to take root. That night the 5 of them sat together by the fire. Ben read to the girls from a book of frontier tales. Rose fell asleep in his lap. Emma leaned against Maggie's shoulder. And Rachel, brave Rachel, who had protected her sisters through so much, finally let herself be a child again, laughing at the story's hero outwitting a pack of coyotes. For a moment they were a family, but Rachel's laughter faded as she looked at Ben with those 2 old eyes. "Mr. Crawford," she said quietly, "what happens if the judge says no? What happens if we have to go back?" Ben set the book aside and pulled Rachel close. "Then we'll find another way. I promise you, Rachel, you and your sisters are not going back to that place. Not while I'm alive." He meant every word. But Ben didn't know yet just how hard Eleanor Ashford would make him fight to keep that promise. The next morning Webb arrived with more news from his investigation. He had interviewed the 5 other children removed from Garrett's farm. One of them, a 10-year-old boy named Danny, had kept a journal carefully documenting every beating, every missed meal, every cruelty inflicted by Garrett. It was evidence, Webb said, strong evidence. But there was more. Webb had also begun investigating Mercy Home's finances, and what he found was damning. Eleanor Ashford received $15 per month from the territorial government for each child in her care, but her actual expenses per child were less than $3. Where was the rest of the money going? Webb dug deeper. He found that Garrett had been paying Ashford $5 per month for each child he took from the orphanage. It wasn't adoption. It wasn't even apprenticeship. It was trafficking. Ashford was selling children to labor farms and pocketing the profit. This changes everything. Webb said, spreading the documents across Ben's kitchen table. If we can prove this to the court, Ashford loses all credibility. The judge won't send children back to an institution run by a criminal. But proving it won't be easy, Maggie said, reading over the papers. These are just numbers. Ashford will say it's accounting errors. Webb nodded. That's why we need more. I'm going to Cheyenne tomorrow to talk to other orphanages, other farms. If Garrett wasn't the only one, if this is a pattern, we have her." While Webb investigated, Ben and Maggie worked on making a real home for the girls. They converted the spare bedroom into a proper children's room with 3 beds, warm quilts, and a window that looked out over the meadow. Maggie sewed new clothes. Ben carved wooden toys during the long evenings, and slowly, day by day, the girls began to heal. Rose was the easiest. At 4 years old, she was young enough to adapt quickly. Within a week, she was calling Maggie Mama and following Ben around the ranch like a shadow. She loved the horses, especially Thunder, and would stand for hours watching them graze in the pasture. Emma was harder. The 7-year-old had nightmares every night, waking up screaming that Mr. Garrett was coming. Maggie would sit with her singing old Irish lullabies until Emma fell back asleep. During the day, Emma was quiet and watchful, always staying close to Rachel. But it was Rachel who worried Ben the most. The 12-year-old carried the weight of the world on her thin shoulders. She couldn't relax, couldn't let herself believe this was real. She checked the doors every night before bed. She hid food under her pillow just in case. And she watched Ben and Maggie with careful, measuring eyes, waiting for the moment when they would tire of 3 orphans and send them away. 2 weeks after the rescue, Ben found Rachel sitting alone in the barn, staring at nothing. He sat down beside her. "Can't sleep." Rachel shook her head. "Every time I close my eyes, I see that night. The snow, the cold. I thought we were going to die. I thought I had failed them." Ben was quiet for a moment. "You didn't fail, Rachel. You saved them. You kept Emma and Rose alive until I found you. That took more courage than anything I've ever seen." Rachel looked at him with those ancient eyes. "When will you get tired of us, Mr. Crawford? When will we become too much trouble?" Ben felt something break inside his chest. He turned to face her fully. "Listen to me, Rachel. I know you've been let down before. Your uncle made you a promise and broke it. The orphanage promised you safety and sent you to Garrett. I understand why you can't trust words anymore." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. It was a photograph, faded and creased, showing a young man in a Union Army uniform standing next to another soldier. "This was my friend David. We fought together in the war. The last battle at Appomattox, I got permission to leave early. My wife was sick and I wanted to see her before she died. David volunteered to take my place on patrol that night." Ben's voice grew thick. "He was killed, shot by a Confederate sniper. I got home to find my wife and son had died 2 days before I arrived. I lost everyone, and I've spent 24 years carrying the guilt that David died in my place." Rachel stared at the photograph. "Your name?" Ben continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Patterson. Same as David's. When you told me your name that first night, I thought maybe it was a sign, a chance to finally do something right, to save someone instead of losing them." He looked directly into Rachel's eyes. "So no, I will never get tired of you. You and Emma and Rose are my chance to be more than a lonely old cowboy waiting to die. You're my chance to be a father again. And I swear to you on David's memory, I will fight with everything I have to keep you safe." Rachel was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I'm scared to believe you." Ben pulled her into a gentle hug. "I know. But being scared and doing it anyway, that's real courage, Rachel. And you're the bravest person I know." They sat together in the quiet barn, and for the first time since her parents died, Rachel let someone else carry part of her burden. The next day, Ben enrolled Rachel and Emma in the school in Pine Ridge. It was a small building with 1 room and 20 students ranging from 6 to 14 years old. The teacher, a stern woman named Mrs. Morrison, welcomed them with professional courtesy, but warned Ben that any disruption would not be tolerated. Rachel and Emma's first day was difficult. The other children stared at them, whispered about them. Everyone in town knew the story by now. The 3 orphan girls rescued from the blizzard, the ones fighting to stay with the old cowboy. During lunch, a boy named Tommy, 13 years old and mean-spirited, approached Emma in the schoolyard. "Hey, orphan," he said loudly. "Why did your parents die? Didn't they love you enough to stay alive?" Emma's face crumpled. Rachel, who had been watching from across the yard, was there in seconds. "Take it back," she said, her voice shaking with fury. Tommy laughed. "Make me orphan." Rachel punched him in the face. Tommy fell backward, blood streaming from his nose. The other children gasped. Mrs. Morrison came running out of the schoolhouse, her face livid. "Rachel Crawford," she shouted, "violence is absolutely forbidden. You are suspended for 5 days." That evening, when Ben came to pick up the girls, Mrs. Morrison gave him a stern lecture about discipline and proper behavior. Ben listened politely, then turned to Rachel. "Did he deserve it?" he asked. Rachel nodded, not meeting his eyes. "Yes, sir. He was cruel to Emma." Ben looked at Mrs. Morrison. "Then I'll talk to Rachel about better ways to handle cruelty, but I won't punish her for protecting her sister." Mrs. Morrison's mouth tightened. "Mr. Crawford, this kind of permissiveness will not help your adoption case. The court expects proper discipline." Ben's voice remained calm but firm. "The court can expect what it wants, ma'am, but these girls have been through enough. I won't punish courage, even when it's misguided." On the ride home, Rachel was silent, clearly expecting punishment despite Ben's words to the teacher. Instead, he pulled the wagon to a stop halfway between town and the ranch. "What you did was wrong," he said quietly. "Not because Tommy didn't deserve it, but because there are better ways to fight back against cruelty." Rachel looked up at him, confused. "In the war, I learned that the strongest people aren't the ones who hit first. They're the ones who stand firm and don't let cruel words break them. Tommy wanted to hurt you and Emma. By hitting him, you gave him that power." He reached over and lifted her chin so she had to look at him. "But I also want you to know something. I understand why you did it. You've been protecting your sisters alone for so long that fighting is all you know how to do. But you're not alone anymore, Rachel. When someone is cruel, you can come to me or Maggie. We'll fight that battle with you. You don't have to do it all yourself." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know how to stop," she whispered. "I don't know how to not be scared all the time." Ben pulled her into a hug, something he was still learning how to do after 8 years of touching no one. "Then we'll figure it out together." That night, as Maggie tucked the girls into bed, Rachel asked a question that had been weighing on her. "Mama Maggie, what happens if the judge says we can't stay?" Maggie sat on the edge of Rachel's bed and took her hand. "Then your father and I will appeal to a higher court, and if that doesn't work, we'll find another way. But Rachel, you need to hear this. Even if the worst happens, even if somehow you're taken from us, you will always be our daughters. Always. That doesn't change because of what a judge says." The word daughters hung in the air like a benediction. The 45 days passed in a strange combination of ordinary routine and mounting tension. Ben and Maggie built a life with the girls, teaching them, caring for them, loving them. But always in the background was the knowledge that it could all be taken away. Webb continued his investigation and found more damning evidence. 3 other farms in Wyoming Territory had taken children from Mercy Home under the same arrangement as Garrett. All of them paid Eleanor Ashford monthly fees. All of them worked the children like slaves. Webb documented everything, built a case that should have been ironclad. But Eleanor Ashford was not sitting idle. She hired her own lawyer, a man named Jonas Shaw, who had a reputation for winning cases through any means necessary. Shaw began investigating Ben, looking for anything that could be used against him in court. And he found something. 20 years ago, after Ben lost his wife and son, after he came home from the war to find everyone he loved dead, he had suffered from what they called soldier's heart back then. Now people were starting to call it shell shock. Ben had been treated by a doctor in Cheyenne for 2 years, seen weekly, for nightmares and episodes of crippling anxiety. Shaw obtained those medical records. Webb came to the ranch as soon as he heard his face grim. "Ben, they're going to use your medical history against you. They'll argue you're mentally unfit to raise children." Ben sat heavily in his chair. "I haven't had an episode in 18 years. I know. And we'll get Dr. Carter to testify to that. But Shaw is good at twisting facts. He'll make it sound worse than it was." The hearing was set for January 15, 1890. They had 3 weeks to prepare. During those 3 weeks, something shifted in the Crawford household. The fear and uncertainty that had been lurking beneath the surface came out into the open. Rachel's nightmares got worse. Emma stopped talking almost completely. Even little Rose became clingy and tearful. One night, Ben found Rachel sitting on the porch in the freezing cold, staring out at the darkness. "You'll get sick out here," he said gently. Rachel didn't turn around. "It's my fault," she said. "If I hadn't punched Tommy, if I had been better behaved, maybe the judge would let us stay." Ben sat down beside her despite the cold. "Rachel, listen to me. None of this is your fault. You're a 12-year-old girl who's been through hell. You're allowed to make mistakes. You're allowed to be scared and angry. That doesn't make you unworthy of love. But what if it's not enough? What if you and Mama Maggie try your best and we still have to go back?" "Then I'll come get you," Ben said firmly. "I don't care what the law says. I'll come get you and we'll go somewhere the law can't reach us. Canada maybe, or Mexico. We'll start over." Rachel finally looked at him, her eyes wide. "You would do that? You would break the law for us?" Ben met her gaze steadily. "Rachel, I would burn down the whole world to keep you and your sisters safe. You are my daughters now, and a father protects his children no matter what." For the first time, Rachel smiled. The night before the hearing, Ben couldn't sleep. He sat by the fire, turning the photograph of David over and over in his hands. Maggie came down the stairs and sat beside him. "Are you scared?" she asked. "Terrified." "Me too." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Maggie spoke again. "Ben, I need to tell you something. This marriage, it started as just paper, just a way to help the girls. But somewhere along the way, it became real for me. You're a good man, a kind man, and I've come to care for you deeply." Ben looked at her in surprise. Maggie smiled sadly. "I'm not asking you to love me back. I know your heart is still with your first wife. I just wanted you to know that when I stand up in that courtroom tomorrow and tell them we're a family, I won't be lying." Ben reached over and took her hand. "Maggie, I don't know if I'm capable of loving anyone the way I loved Sarah, but I do know that you've given me back something I thought I'd lost forever. Hope, purpose, a reason to wake up in the morning. That's real. That matters." They sat together by the dying fire, two broken people who had found something worth fighting for. The next morning, the entire Crawford family dressed in their best clothes and rode to the courthouse in Pine Ridge. The building was packed. It seemed like the whole town had come to watch. Some faces were friendly, like Pastor Helen and Sheriff Miller. Others were coldly judgmental. Eleanor Ashford sat on one side of the courtroom with Jonas Shaw, both of them radiating confidence. Ben and Maggie sat on the other side with Webb, the three girls pressed between them. Judge Patricia Holloway entered and everyone stood. She was 62 years old with iron gray hair and a face that revealed nothing. She had a reputation for being fair but harsh, merciful but exacting. No one knew which way she would rule. The hearing began. Gregory Foster, the territorial attorney representing the interests of orphaned children, stood first. He was not an unkind man. He was simply doing his job, and he did it with methodical precision. "Your Honor," he began, his voice carrying through the crowded courtroom, "no one here disputes that Benjamin Crawford is a good man. He rescued 3 children from certain death during one of the worst blizzards this territory has seen in 20 years. That act alone speaks to his character." He paused, letting the acknowledgement settle before continuing. "However, Your Honor, rescuing a life and raising a child are two very different things. The law exists to protect children, to ensure they are placed in homes that can provide not just shelter and food, but stability, guidance, and a future. Mr. Crawford is 51 years old, living 15 miles from town with no experience raising children. His recent marriage to Mrs. Hayes occurred mere weeks after these children arrived, suggesting a union of convenience rather than genuine partnership." Ben felt Maggie stiffen beside him. Webb had warned them this argument would come. Furthermore, Foster continued, pulling a document from his folder. "Mr. Crawford has a documented history of mental instability. From 1873 to 1875, he received treatment for what was then called soldier's heart. The medical records indicate severe anxiety nightmares and episodes of disassociation. Rachel gripped Ben's hand tighter. Emma began to cry softly. Little Rose buried her face in Maggie's skirt. Foster called his first witness. Dr. John Carter, now 70 years old and long retired, took the stand. He looked uncomfortable, his eyes avoiding Ben's. Dr. Carter Foster said gently, "You treated Mr. Crawford after the war, correct?" "Yes." "For approximately 2 years. Can you describe his condition?" Carter shifted in his seat. He suffered from what we now understand as post-traumatic stress. He had nightmares, difficulty sleeping, and periods of intense anxiety. This was not uncommon among soldiers who had seen significant combat. And in your professional opinion, would these symptoms make him unsuitable as a guardian for young children? Carter was quiet for a long moment. "I cannot say with certainty. Mental afflictions are not well understood. However, I can confirm that during his treatment, Mr. Crawford experienced episodes that could be considered unstable." Ben closed his eyes. He felt the weight of every pair of eyes in the courtroom on him. Foster thanked Dr. Carter and called his next witness. Mrs. Morrison, the schoolteacher, took the stand with an air of righteous disapproval. Mrs. Morrison Foster began, "Can you tell the court about the incident involving Rachel Crawford at your school?" Mrs. Morrison straightened in her chair. "Rachel struck another student, causing injury. When I suspended her for 5 days, as is appropriate for violent behavior, Mr. Crawford defended her actions. He showed no interest in proper discipline or correction. This suggests a permissive household that does not prepare children for civilized society. And has Rachel returned to school since the suspension? Yes, but she remains withdrawn and defensive. The other children fear her." Foster nodded sympathetically. "So in your professional opinion as an educator, is the Crawford household providing these children with proper guidance?" Mrs. Morrison's answer was swift. "No, sir. I do not believe it is." When Foster sat down, Webb stood slowly. He looked calm, but Ben could see the tension in his shoulders. This was the moment everything depended on. "Your Honor." Webb began, his voice steady and clear. "The prosecution has painted a picture of Mr. Crawford that is incomplete at best and misleading at worst. Yes, he is 51 years old. So was Abraham Lincoln when he became president. Age brings wisdom, patience, and stability. These are assets, not liabilities. He moved to stand directly before the judge. Yes, Mr. Crawford married Mrs. Hayes recently. But anyone who has spent 5 minutes in their company can see this is not a marriage of convenience. It is a union of 2 people who understand loss, who understand love, and who have chosen to build something beautiful from the ashes of their grief." Webb called Sheriff Miller as his first witness. The big man took the stand with the authority of someone who had seen the worst of human nature and still believed in justice. Sheriff Miller Webb said, "You've known Benjamin Crawford for how long?" 25 years. Since the war. "And in that time, have you ever had cause to doubt his character?" "Never. Not once." "Tell the court what you found at Walter Garrett's farm." Miller's face hardened. "I found 5 children living in conditions unfit for animals. They were malnourished, beaten, worked beyond their capacity. One boy had documented 63 separate beatings in a journal he kept hidden. When we removed them, they were so afraid they couldn't speak for 3 days. And when you saw the 3 Patterson girls at Mr. Crawford's ranch," Miller's expression softened. "They were different children, clean-fed, clothed properly. But more than that, they were happy. They laughed. They played. Emma was drawing pictures. Rose was learning to ride a horse. And Rachel, who had carried the weight of the world on her shoulders, was finally allowed to be a child again." Webb let that image settle before continuing. "In your professional opinion as an officer of the law, are these children safe with Benjamin Crawford?" Miller looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor, those children are safer with Ben Crawford than they would be anywhere else in this territory. He would die before he let harm come to them." Next, Webb called Pastor Helen Grant. She took the stand with the quiet dignity of someone who had devoted her life to serving others. Pastor Grant Webb said, "You've been the spiritual leader of this community for 15 years. You know everyone here. Tell us about Benjamin Crawford." Helen smiled. Ben is the kind of man who doesn't speak much, but when he does, you listen. He's honest, hard-working, and deeply principled. After his wife and son died, he could have become bitter. Instead, he became gentle. He turned his grief into compassion. And what about his marriage to Margaret Hayes? Helen's smile widened. I performed the ceremony. I watched them exchange vows. And I'll tell you what I saw. I saw two people who understood that love isn't always thunder and lightning. Sometimes it's quiet and steady, built on respect and shared purpose. That's the strongest kind of love there is. When Maggie took the stand, every eye in the courtroom was on her. She sat with her hands folded, her back straight, her face serene, despite the tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. Mrs. Crawford Foster said, "Standing for cross-examination, you married Benjamin Crawford 3 weeks after meeting these children. Isn't that remarkably fast?" Maggie met his gaze without flinching. "Sir, I have known Benjamin Crawford for 4 years. I worked in his home as his housekeeper. I knew his character long before these children arrived. But the marriage itself was recent and sudden." "Yes. Isn't it true that this marriage was arranged specifically to improve Mr. Crawford's chances of adoption?" Maggie was quiet for a long moment. The courtroom held its breath. "Yes," she said finally. "That's how it started." A murmur ran through the crowd. Foster smiled slightly, thinking he had scored a point. But Maggie wasn't finished. It started as a legal arrangement, a way to give 3 terrified children a fighting chance at a real family. "But sir, something changed along the way. I lost my son 5 years ago to the river. He drowned while I was hanging laundry. I heard him calling for help and I ran, but I wasn't fast enough. I have lived with that failure every day since." Her voice broke, but she continued. "Those 3 girls gave me a second chance, a chance to be a mother again, a chance to save someone. And Benjamin gave me something too. He gave me purpose and partnership and a home that feels alive again. So yes, we married quickly. Yes, it was initially for legal reasons. But I stand here today and tell you that I love my husband. I love our daughters. And I will fight with everything I have to keep this family together." The courtroom was utterly silent. Foster had no more questions. When Maggie returned to her seat, Rachel threw her arms around her and whispered "Mama" so softly that only those nearby could hear. Webb called one final witness before breaking for the day. Hiram Morrison, the schoolteacher's husband and a farmer, took the stand with obvious reluctance. "Mr. Morrison, Webb said your wife testified that Rachel Crawford is a violent and undisciplined child. Do you agree?" Morrison glanced at his wife, then back at Webb. "I saw what happened that day. My wife called me to help after the incident. Tommy Bradford had been tormenting that little girl Emma, something fierce, calling her names, mocking her dead parents. Rachel defended her sister. Was it right to hit him? No. But was it understandable? Yes, sir, it was." He looked directly at Judge Holloway. "Your Honor, I got 3 daughters of my own. If someone was cruel to one of them and the other defended her, I'd be disappointed in the method, but proud of the loyalty. That's what family does. They protect each other." Webb thanked him and sat down. Foster looked frustrated. Judge Holloway called for a recess until the following day. That night, the Crawford family returned to the ranch in heavy silence. The girls went to bed early, exhausted by the emotional weight of the day. Ben sat on the porch despite the January cold, staring out at the darkness. Maggie found him there an hour later. "Come inside. You'll freeze. Can't sleep." Maggie sat beside him, wrapping a blanket around both their shoulders. "What you said today," Ben said quietly, "about loving me. Did you mean it?" "Every word." Ben was quiet for a long moment. "I thought I was done with love after Sarah died. I thought that part of me was buried with her and our son. But these last few weeks with you and the girls, I felt something I didn't think I'd ever feel again. Not the same as before. Different, but real." He turned to look at her in the moonlight. "I don't know if I can say the words yet, but I want you to know that you matter to me, Maggie. You're not just helping me with the girls. You've become essential." Maggie leaned her head on his shoulder. "That's enough for now." The second day of the hearing began with Judge Holloway's announcement that she wanted to hear from the children themselves. Foster objected, arguing that young children could be coached or confused, but Holloway overruled him. "I want to hear from the one most directly affected by this decision," she said. "Rachel Crawford, please take the stand." Rachel walked to the witness chair on trembling legs. At 12 years old, she looked even younger, small and fragile in her Sunday dress. But when she sat down and looked out at the courtroom, her eyes held that same ancient strength Ben had seen the night he found her in the snow. Rachel, Judge Holloway said gently, "You don't have to be afraid. I just want to ask you some questions. Can you tell me about your life before Mr. Crawford found you?" Rachel took a deep breath. "My mama died when I was 10. She had tuberculosis, and she couldn't breathe, and I held her hand until she stopped. My papa tried to take care of us, but he died in the mine a year later. Our uncle said he would keep us, but after 3 months he took us to Mercy Home and never came back." Her voice was steady, factual, as if reciting something that had happened to someone else. "We lived at Mercy Home for 2 years. It was crowded and the food wasn't good, but it was safe. Then Mr. Garrett came and said he wanted to adopt children to work on his farm. Mrs. Ashford said it was a wonderful opportunity." "What was life like on Mr. Garrett's farm?" the judge asked softly. Rachel's composure cracked slightly. "We slept in the barn. There were 8 of us. We worked from when the sun came up until it went down, cleaning stalls, hauling water, feeding animals. If we were slow or made mistakes, Mr. Garrett hit us with a belt, sometimes worse." She looked down at her hands. "Emma got sick one day and couldn't work. She was crying because her stomach hurt so bad. I tried to steal a piece of bread from the kitchen to give her. Mr. Garrett caught me. He hit me in front of all the other children. Then he said he was done with us. He said he was going to send Emma and Rose away to a farm in Montana and I would never see them again." The courtroom was absolutely still. That's when I decided we had to run. I waited until the blizzard started because I knew Mr. Garrett wouldn't follow us in that weather. I thought we could walk to town and find help. But the storm was worse than I expected, and Emma's shoes had holes and her feet started bleeding. We couldn't go any further. I found that tree and I put Emma and Rose in my coat and I tried to keep them warm. Rachel's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I thought we were going to die. I thought I had failed them. I promised my mama before she died that I would always keep my sisters together. I promised. And I thought I had broken that promise." Judge Holloway leaned forward. "But then Mr. Crawford found you." Rachel nodded, tears streaming down her face now. "He came out of the snow like an angel. I thought I was seeing things that I was already dead. But he was real. He picked us up and he took us home and he and Mama Maggie saved us. Tell me about your life with the Crawfords," the judge said. Rachel smiled through her tears. "It's the first time I felt safe since Mama died. Papa reads to us every night. Mama teaches me to cook and sew. Rose has a real bed with warm blankets. Emma is learning to read. We have enough food and nobody hits us and nobody yells." She looked directly at Judge Holloway with desperate intensity. "Your Honor, I know what people say, that Papa is too old, that he and Mama got married too fast, that I'm too violent. But none of that matters. What matters is that they love us, really love us. Not because they have to, but because they want to. That's what family is supposed to be." Foster stood for his cross-examination. He approached Rachel carefully, his voice gentle. "Rachel, I'm not trying to upset you. I just need to understand. You say Mr. Crawford loves you, but you've only known him for 6 weeks. How can you be sure?" Rachel looked at him with those 2 old eyes. "Sir, I'm 12 years old. I've watched my mother die. I've buried my father. I've been abandoned by my uncle, sold by Mrs. Ashford, and beaten by Mr. Garrett. I know what it looks like when adults lie to children. I know what empty promises sound like." She turned to look at Ben sitting in the gallery. "Papa doesn't make empty promises. When he says we're safe, we're safe. When he says he'll protect us, he means it. I asked him once what would happen if the judge said we had to leave. You know what he said?" Foster shook his head. "He said he would come get us anyway, that he would take us to Canada or Mexico if he had to, that he would break the law and burn down the world to keep us safe. That's not something you say to children you don't love. That's something you say to your daughters." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Holloway banged her gavel for silence. Foster tried one more approach. "Rachel, your teacher says you were violent at school. Don't you think Mr. Crawford should have punished you more severely?" Rachel's face hardened. "Tommy Bradford called my sister names about our dead parents. He made her cry. I hit him. Was it right? No. Papa told me there are better ways to fight back. But he also told me he understood why I did it. He told me I was brave for protecting Emma even if my method was wrong. He taught me instead of just punishing me." She looked at Foster with surprising fierceness. "Sir, I've been punished my whole life for things that weren't my fault. For being born poor, for being orphaned, for being hungry. Papa was the first person who ever tried to teach me instead of just hitting me. That's what a real father does." Foster had no more questions. When Rachel stepped down, Ben met her at the gallery rail and pulled her into his arms. She buried her face in his shoulder and sobbed, all the fear and tension of the testimony finally breaking through her careful control. Judge Holloway watched this with an expression that revealed nothing. "The court will adjourn until tomorrow morning, when I will deliver my verdict." The Crawford family returned to the ranch that night, not knowing if it would be their last night together. Maggie made a special dinner, all the girls' favorite foods. They sat around the table and tried to pretend everything was normal, but the fear hung over them like a storm cloud. After dinner, Ben took all 3 girls out to see the cottonwood tree. The moon was bright enough to light their way, and the snow crunched beneath their boots. "This tree saved your lives," Ben said, placing his hand on the rough bark. "It gave you shelter when you needed it most. I want you to remember that. No matter what happens tomorrow, you survived. You're strong, you're fighters, and you're loved." Rachel looked up at the bare branches reaching toward the stars. "Papa, what if the judge says no? What if we have to leave?" Ben knelt down so he was eye level with all 3 girls. "Then I will do exactly what I told you I would do. I will come get you. I don't care what the law says. You are my daughters. Nothing will change that." Little Rose, who had been so quiet, suddenly threw her arms around Ben's neck. "I don't want to go, Papa. I want to stay with you and Mama forever." Ben held her tight, his eyes meeting Maggie's over Rose's small head. "I know, sweetheart. I know." That night, none of them slept much. Ben sat up by the fire, alternating between prayer and planning. If the judge ruled against them, he would need money supplies, a destination. He mentally cataloged everything he could sell, every contact he had in other territories. Maggie sat beside him, understanding his silence. "You really would do it," she said quietly. "You would give up everything and run, in a heartbeat." She took his hand. "Then I'm coming with you." Ben looked at her in surprise. "Maggie, you would be an accessory to kidnapping. You could go to prison." She smiled. "Ben, I told you, those girls are my daughters too. Where they go, I go. Where you go, I go. That's what family means." Something warm unfurled in Ben's chest, something that felt dangerously close to what he had felt for Sarah all those years ago. Different, yes. Quieter, but no less real. "Thank you," he whispered. The next morning the courtroom was even more packed than before. Word had spread through the territory about the case, and people had come from as far as Cheyenne to hear the verdict. Some supported Ben. Others believed the law should be upheld, regardless of emotion. Eleanor Ashford sat in the front row with Jonas Shaw, her face a mask of confident satisfaction. She had already made arrangements for the girls to be transferred to a different orphanage far from Wyoming, somewhere Ben Crawford could never find them. Judge Holloway entered, and the room fell silent. She sat at her bench and looked out over the assembled crowd with stern, measuring eyes. "I have reviewed all testimony and evidence presented in this case." She began, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "This has been one of the most difficult decisions of my 30-year career on the bench." She opened a folder and pulled out several documents. The law in Wyoming Territory regarding adoption is clear. Courts prefer to place children with married couples of appropriate age who have demonstrated the ability to provide material support and moral guidance. Benjamin Crawford is 51 years old. His marriage to Margaret Hayes occurred mere weeks before this hearing. He has a documented history of mental health treatment, and one of the children in question has already demonstrated behavioral problems at school. Ben felt his heart sink. This was it. The judge was going to rule against them. Rachel gripped his hand so hard her fingernails drew blood. Emma began to cry. Rose buried her face in Maggie's lap. Therefore, Judge Holloway continued, according to the strict letter of the law, I should deny this adoption petition. The courtroom erupted. Ashford smiled triumphantly. Ben closed his eyes, already planning their escape route north. But Judge Holloway wasn't finished. She banged her gavel hard, demanding silence. However, she said, her voice cutting through the noise, I did not become a judge to blindly follow laws that fail to serve justice. And there is something I have not shared with this court, something relevant to this case. She stood a gesture so unusual that the entire room fell into shocked silence. In 1845, when I was 17 years old, I was an orphan. My parents died of cholera when I was 15, and I spent 2 years in an overcrowded, underfunded orphanage in Massachusetts. I was angry, lost, and convinced I would never have a family again. Her voice grew thick with emotion. Then a couple came to the orphanage, Samuel and Martha Patterson. They were in their 50s, too old by most standards to take in a teenager, but they saw something in me worth saving. They brought me to their farm, gave me a home, loved me as their own daughter. They changed my life. Ben's breath caught. Patterson. The same surname as Rachel, Emma, and Rose. Judge Holloway looked directly at Ben. Samuel and Martha had a son. His name was David. He died in the war at Appomattox. The photograph. David Patterson in his Union uniform. The friend who died in Ben's place. Mr. Crawford. The judge continued, I received a letter from my father Samuel after David's death. In it he mentioned you, the soldier who had tried to save his son, the one who carried the guilt of David's sacrifice for years afterward. She smiled, and for the first time warmth entered her stern features. My brother David taught me that family is not about blood. It's about choice. It's about love. Samuel and Martha taught me the same lesson. And today I see that lesson played out again in this courtroom. Judge Holloway picked up her gavel. The testimony of Rachel Crawford moved me deeply. That child has endured more hardship than most adults will face in a lifetime, yet she spoke with clarity, courage, and wisdom. She knows what love looks like because she has finally found it. She looked at Maggie. Margaret Crawford stood before this court and admitted that her marriage began as a legal convenience. But she also demonstrated something far more powerful. She showed us that love can grow from the most practical beginnings into something profound and real. Then she looked at Ben. Benjamin Crawford, you are not perfect. You have scars, both visible and invisible, but those scars have made you gentle. They have made you compassionate, and they have made you exactly the kind of father these 3 girls need. She raised her gavel. Therefore, I hereby approve the adoption petition of Benjamin Crawford and Margaret Crawford. Rachel Emma and Rose Patterson shall henceforth be known as Rachel Emma and Rose Crawford. They are your daughters in the eyes of the law and, more importantly, in the eyes of justice. This adoption is final and binding effective immediately. The gavel came down with a sound like thunder. The courtroom exploded. People cheered and applauded. Ben sat frozen in shock for a moment before Rachel threw herself into his arms, sobbing. Emma and Rose followed the 3 girls, piling onto their father in a tangle of arms and tears and laughter. Maggie wrapped her arms around all of them, crying and laughing at the same time. We won, Rachel kept saying through her tears. Papa, we won. We get to stay. We're a family. We're really a family. Pastor Helen was crying. Sheriff Miller was grinning and wiping his eyes. Even Thomas Webb, normally so composed, had tears streaming down his face. Across the courtroom, Eleanor Ashford stood with her face white with fury. Jonas Shaw was already gathering his papers, eager to distance himself from the losing side. But Ben barely noticed them. All he could see was his daughters, his wife, his family. Judge Holloway called for order one final time. When the room quieted, she asked Ben to approach the bench. He stood still, holding Rose, and walked forward. The judge looked at him with eyes that held both sternness and kindness. Mr. Crawford, I want you to understand something. I did not make this decision lightly, and I did not make it solely because of my connection to your friend David. I made it because those girls need you, and because you need them." She leaned forward. "David's death was not your fault. You carried that guilt for 24 years, punishing yourself for surviving. But today you honored his memory in the most beautiful way possible. You saved 3 lives that would have been lost without you. You created a family from brokenness. That is redemption, Mr. Crawford. That is grace." Ben's voice was hoarse. "Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you for giving me this chance." Judge Holloway smiled. "Don't thank me. Thank your daughters for being brave enough to tell the truth. Thank your wife for loving you. And thank yourself for having the courage to try." She banged her gavel one final time. "Court is adjourned." The Crawford family left the courthouse together, stepping out into the bright January sunshine. Snow still covered the ground, but spring was coming. Ben could feel it in the air. They rode home slowly, savoring the journey. The girls chattered excitedly about what they would do now that they were really truly staying forever. Emma wanted to plant a garden in the spring. Rose wanted to learn to ride thunder by herself. Rachel just wanted to sleep through a whole night without nightmares. That evening, after a celebratory dinner, where Maggie made a special cake, Ben gathered everyone in front of the fire. "I want to give you girls something," he said. He went to his room and returned with 3 small boxes. He handed one to each girl. Inside each box was a delicate necklace with a small pendant. Rachel's said daughter. Emma's said beloved. Rose's said forever. The girls put them on with trembling fingers, touching the pendants like they were sacred objects. "You are my daughters now, and always." Ben said, his voice thick. "Not because a judge said so, but because that's what my heart says, and nothing will ever change that." Rachel threw her arms around him. "I love you, Papa." It was the first time she had said it out loud. Ben held her tight. "I love you too, Rachel. I love all of you." That night, after the girls were asleep, Ben and Maggie stood on the porch looking out at the snow-covered land. The stars were brilliant overhead, sharp and clear in the cold air. Maggie leaned against him. "We did it," she said softly. "We're a family." Ben put his arm around her. "We are. And Maggie, what you said in court about loving me, I want you to know that I feel the same. It took me a while to realize it, but somewhere along the way this stopped being pretend for me too." Maggie looked up at him, her eyes shining. "Ben Crawford, are you saying you love me?" He smiled, really smiled for what felt like the first time in 20 years. "Yes, Maggie Hayes." "Crawford, I am." She kissed him then, soft and sweet, a kiss that tasted like new beginnings and second chances. Behind them, unnoticed, Rachel stood in the doorway watching. She smiled and went back to bed, finally truly believing that good things could last. The week following the court's decision passed in a haze of joy and relief that felt almost dreamlike. Rachel woke each morning expecting to find it had all been a cruel illusion, but every time she opened her eyes, she was in her own bed in the room she shared with her sisters. Emma and Rose were there, breathing softly in their sleep. And downstairs she could hear Papa stoking the fire and Mama humming an old Irish tune as she prepared breakfast. It was real. It was finally gloriously real. The town of Pine Ridge responded to the verdict with surprising warmth. People who had been skeptical or outright hostile before now stopped the Crawfords on the street to offer congratulations. Even Mrs. Morrison, the stern schoolteacher, pulled Ben aside one afternoon and apologized for her harsh testimony. "I was wrong about your family," she said quietly. "I see that now. Rachel has been different since the hearing. Calmer, more confident. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." Pastor Helen organized a celebration at the church, a potluck dinner where the entire community could welcome the Crawford girls officially into their midst. Tables overflowed with food. Children ran between the pews playing games. And for the first time in years, Ben found himself surrounded by friendship and fellowship instead of isolation. Thomas Webb pulled him aside during the celebration. "You know Eleanor Ashford has been arrested, don't you?" Ben looked at him in surprise. He had been so focused on his family that he hadn't thought much about what happened to the woman who had tried to tear them apart. Webb nodded. The territorial marshal took her into custody 3 days ago. The evidence we gathered about her arrangement with Garrett led to a full investigation. They found 2 other farms operating the same way, children being sold as labor under the guise of adoption. Ashford kept detailed financial records, which was her downfall. She documented her own crimes. "What will happen to her?" Ben asked. Webb's expression was grim. "She'll stand trial in Cheyenne. Given the evidence, she's looking at 10 to 15 years in prison. Mercy Home has been shut down permanently. The children there have been transferred to other institutions with proper oversight. And Garrett's still in jail awaiting trial. With the testimony from Danny and the other children plus Rachel's account, he won't see freedom for a very long time." But Ben's relief was short-lived. 3 weeks after the hearing, Thomas Webb rode to the ranch with grim news. Jonas Shaw had posted bail for Walter Garrett. The man who had beaten and starved 8 children was walking free pending trial. "How is that possible?" Ben demanded, his voice tight with fury. Webb's face was troubled. Shaw argued lack of evidence for the most serious charges. The judge set bail at $500. Someone paid it. "I suspect Ashford, though I can't prove it." "Does Garrett know where we are?" "The whole territory knows where you are, Ben." The trial was in every newspaper from here to Cheyenne. That night, Ben slept with his rifle beside the bed. He checked the locks twice, walked the perimeter of the ranch in the darkness. Maggie saw the tension in his shoulders, but said nothing. She simply made sure the girls stayed close to the house. The attack came on the 4th night. Ben woke to Thunder's frantic neighing. He was out of bed and grabbing his rifle before his eyes were fully open. Through the window he saw a figure moving near the barn. A match flared in the darkness. Maggie was already awake, her hand on his arm. "I'll watch the girls. You be careful." Ben slipped out the back door and moved silently toward the barn. The figure was larger now, and Ben could smell kerosene. The bastard was trying to burn down the barn with the horses inside. Garrett Ben's voice cut through the night. "Step away from that building." Walter Garrett turned, and even in the moonlight Ben could see the rage twisting his features. He was drunk, swaying slightly, a whiskey bottle in one hand and a lit torch in the other. "You ruined me, Crawford," Garrett slurred. "Took my workers, got me arrested. Now you're gonna pay. Those weren't workers. They were children. And you beat them. They were mine. I paid good money for them. And then you come along playing hero." Garrett threw the torch at the barn. Ben fired a warning shot, but the torch had already landed in the kerosene-soaked hay. Flames erupted instantly. Ben ran for the barn, but Garrett charged at him with a knife. They collided hard, both men going down in the dirt. Garrett was bigger and younger, but he was drunk and sloppy. Ben fought with the desperate strength of a man protecting his family. The knife slashed across Ben's shoulder, and he felt hot blood soaking his shirt. But he managed to land a solid punch to Garrett's jaw, then another. Garrett went down hard. Behind them the barn was fully ablaze now. Thunder and the other horses were screaming inside. Ben struggled to his feet, ignoring the pain in his shoulder, and ran for the barn. He threw open the doors and led the terrified horses out one by one, his lungs burning from the smoke. The last horse, a young mare, was too frightened to move. Ben went back in, wrapped his coat around her head, and pulled her to safety just as part of the roof collapsed. Sheriff Miller arrived with 3 deputies drawn by the flames visible from town. They found Garrett unconscious in the yard and arrested him on the spot. This time there would be no bail. Ben refused to see the doctor until all the horses were accounted for and the fire was contained. The barn was a total loss, but the animals were safe. When Maggie finally got him inside and cleaned the knife wound, her hands were shaking. "You could have been killed," she whispered. "But I wasn't. And Garrett will never hurt anyone again." The girls huddled together by the fire, watching with wide, frightened eyes. Rachel was the first to speak. "Is it over, Papa? Is he really gone?" Ben pulled all 3 girls close, ignoring the pain in his shoulder. "Yes, sweetheart, it's over. He's going to prison for a very long time. You're safe now, all of you." But that night Emma had nightmares again. Rose refused to sleep unless someone was holding her hand, and Rachel lay awake staring at the ceiling, waiting for the next disaster. It would take time, Ben realized, for them to truly feel safe. Garrett's attack had reopened old wounds, but they would heal. Together as a family, they would heal. 2 weeks passed. The new barn was rising from the ashes of the old built with help from neighbors who came from miles around. Ben's shoulder healed, though it ached in cold weather. The girls slowly regained their sense of safety, though Rachel still checked the locks every night. Life seemed to be settling back into its gentle rhythms. Then came the Saturday that would test them all in ways they never imagined. Ben decided to take the family to town for supplies and a small celebration. Garrett was in prison with no possibility of bail, this time awaiting trial on charges of arson and attempted murder in addition to the child abuse charges. The threat, it seemed, was finally over. In Pine Ridge, the town was bustling with the usual Saturday market. Ben and Rachel went into the general store to order more lumber for the barn. Maggie needed fabric from the dry goods shop. "Can you watch your sisters while Mama and I finish our errands?" Ben asked Rachel. Rachel nodded seriously. She took Emma and Rose to look at the penny candy display in the mercantile window while the adults conducted their business. "Stay where I can see you," Rachel told her sisters. "Don't wander off." Emma and Rose nodded obediently. They pressed their noses against the glass, admiring the colorful sweets inside. Rachel stood guard nearby, watching them carefully. But then Mrs. Morrison called to her from across the street, wanting to discuss Rachel's upcoming advanced mathematics lessons. Rachel glanced at her sisters still safely at the window, then stepped a few feet away to speak with the teacher. The conversation lasted perhaps 3 minutes. When Rachel turned back, Emma was standing alone, tears streaming down her face. Rachel's heart stopped. She ran to her sister, grabbing Emma's shoulders. "Where's Rose? Where is she?" Emma was sobbing too hard to speak coherently. She pointed down the street with a shaking hand. "A lady, a fancy lady in a black dress. She said she knew you. She said she was taking Rose to find you." Rachel felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She knew exactly who that fancy lady was. How long ago, Rachel demanded, her voice sharp with terror. "Just now. Maybe 2 minutes." Rachel grabbed Emma's hand and ran toward the general store, shouting for Ben. Her voice carried through the quiet street, drawing attention from everyone nearby. "Papa. Papa Rose is gone. A woman took her." Ben emerged from the store at a run. Rachel's panic clear in her voice. Maggie was right behind him. "What happened?" Rachel explained in gasping bursts, the words tumbling over each other. Emma added details through her tears. A tall woman in expensive black clothes, a black carriage waiting at the edge of town. She said she knew the family. She promised Rose they were going to see Papa. Ben's face went white, then red with fury. Eleanor Ashford. Thomas Webb, who had been in the general store, was already moving. "Sheriff Miller's office is 2 buildings down. I'll get him." Within minutes, Sheriff Miller had organized a search, but Ben already knew where to look. There was only one place Ashford would take Rose. The same estate where she had been arrested before the one the court had allowed her to keep while she awaited trial for the financial crimes. They rode hard, Ben Webb, Sheriff Miller, and 4 armed deputies. Ben pushed his horse faster than was safe, his mind filled with images of Rose terrified and alone, thinking she had been abandoned again. The Ashford estate looked peaceful in the afternoon sun, too peaceful. Ben didn't wait for the sheriff's signal. He dismounted and strode to the front door, kicking it open with one boot. Eleanor Ashford stood in the parlor, perfectly composed, a cup of tea in her hand. "Mr. Crawford," she said calmly, "how nice of you to visit." "Where is she?" Ben's voice was deadly quiet. "Where is my daughter? I'm sure I don't know what you're talking about. I've been home all afternoon." Then Sheriff Miller heard it. The same sound Ben had heard once before, a child crying muffled from somewhere above. They found Rose locked in a 3rd-floor bedroom on the 3rd floor. The 4-year-old was huddled in a corner, her face blotchy from crying, her small body shaking. When she saw Ben, she screamed "Papa" and ran to him. Ben scooped her up, holding her so tightly she squeaked. "The bad lady said you didn't want me anymore." Rose sobbed against his shoulder. "She said I was too much trouble. She said you were sending me back to the orphanage." Ben's jaw clenched so hard he thought his teeth might crack. He looked at Ashford over Rose's head. "You're finished." Sheriff Miller arrested Eleanor Ashford for the second time, this time for kidnapping. There would be no bail, no legal maneuvering, no escape. She had crossed a line that even her powerful connections couldn't protect her from. In the carriage ride back to town, Rose refused to let go of Ben. She sat in his lap, her arms around his neck, her face buried against his chest. She had stopped crying, but she trembled like a leaf in the wind. "Did you really think Papa would send you away?" Maggie asked gently, smoothing Rose's hair. Rose nodded against Ben's shirt. "The lady said he was tired of me, that I was too much work." Ben pulled back enough to look Rose in the eyes. "Rose, listen to me. I will never ever get tired of you. You are my daughter. You will always be my daughter. Nothing anyone says can change that. Do you understand?" Rose nodded, but her eyes were uncertain. "Say it," Ben insisted gently. "Say you're my daughter." "I'm your daughter," Rose whispered, louder. "I'm your daughter, and will you always be my daughter? Always, always." Rose finally smiled just a little. Always. In town, Rachel and Emma were waiting in the street, both girls pale with worry. When they saw Rose safe in Ben's arms, Rachel burst into tears of relief. She ran to them and wrapped her arms around both Rose and Ben, sobbing apologies. I'm sorry. I should have been watching her better. I should have never looked away. I'm so sorry." Ben freed one arm to pull Rachel close too. "This is not your fault," he said firmly, repeating the words he had said before. "You are not responsible for what evil people do. Eleanor Ashford kidnapped Rose. That was her choice, her crime, not yours." But Rachel couldn't stop crying. All the fear, all the old trauma, all the weight of responsibility she had carried for so long, it all came pouring out. Maggie took Rachel's face in her hands. "Listen to me, sweet girl. You are 12 years old. You are not their mother. You are their sister. And it's not your job to protect them from everything. That's our job now, Papa's and mine. You get to be a child too." Rachel nodded, but it would take time for her to truly believe it. That night, Rose refused to let Ben out of her sight. She sat on his lap during dinner. She held his hand when Maggie put her to bed. And when nightmares woke her at 2 in the morning, she crept into Ben and Maggie's room and climbed into bed between them. Ben wrapped his arms around his smallest daughter and held her while she cried. He sang to her something he hadn't done since his own son was small, an old lullaby his mother had taught him. Gradually, Rose's sobs quieted. Her breathing steadied. She fell asleep with one small hand clutching Ben's shirt and the other holding Maggie's hand. "You're a good father," Maggie whispered across Rose's sleeping form. Ben looked down at the child in his arms, this little girl who had been stolen twice in one day, once by Ashford, and once by her own fear that she wasn't wanted. "I almost lost her," he said quietly. "If we'd been 5 minutes later. But we weren't. She's safe, and Ashford will spend years in prison. It's over, Ben. It's really over." Ben nodded, but he didn't sleep that night. He kept watch over Rose, making sure she knew even in her dreams that she was safe, that she was loved, that she was home. The next morning when Rose woke up, she looked at Ben with wide, serious eyes. "Papa." "Yes, sweetheart. Am I really yours forever?" Ben pulled her close. "Forever and always. You're mine and I'm yours. That's what family means." Rose smiled, then a real smile, the first since the kidnapping. "Okay," she said simply. "I believe you." And this time, she did. Ben felt something loosen in his chest. Justice. Real, tangible justice for the girls who had suffered. Ashford would face trial not just for financial crimes, but for kidnapping a child. The sentence would be harsh. Decades, not years. And more importantly, his daughters were safe. All 3 of them. Safe, loved, and finally beginning to heal. That night, as the family rode home from the church, Rose fell asleep against Ben's shoulder. Emma leaned on Maggie, humming softly. But Rachel sat upright, looking out at the winter landscape with thoughtful eyes. "What are you thinking about?" Ben asked her. Rachel was quiet for a moment before answering. I was thinking about all the other children, the ones at Garrett's farm, the ones at Mercy Home. We got saved, but what about them? Ben pulled the wagon to a stop and turned to face her fully. That's a good heart you have, Rachel, caring about others even when you've just found safety yourself. Those children are being taken care of now. Better places, better people. What happened to you and your sisters helped save them too. Your courage, your testimony, it exposed the whole system. Rachel nodded slowly. I hope they find families like we did. I hope they get papas and mamas who love them. They will, Maggie said softly. Because now people are paying attention. Now people care. As January turned into February, life at the Crawford Ranch settled into comfortable routines. The girls went to school each day, though now they did so with confidence instead of fear. Rachel discovered she loved mathematics and reading. Emma showed an unexpected talent for drawing filling pages with sketches of horses and landscapes. Rose, at 5 years old, was learning her letters and numbers with the enthusiasm only small children possess. In the evenings, the family gathered by the fire. Ben read aloud from books borrowed from Pastor Helen's library. Adventures, histories, tales of courage and perseverance. The girls listened with rapt attention, and sometimes Rachel would read chapters herself, her voice growing stronger and more confident with each passing week. Maggie taught the girls all the domestic skills they would need: cooking, sewing, preserving food for winter. But more than that, she taught them they were valuable, capable, worthy of respect. When Emma burned a batch of biscuits and burst into tears expecting punishment, Maggie simply laughed and said, "Everyone burns biscuits when they're learning." They tried again together. On a Saturday in late February, Ben took Rachel out to check the fence line on the north pasture. It was the same route he had ridden the day he found them, and Rachel knew it. They rode in companionable silence until they reached the cottonwood tree. It stood stark and bare against the gray sky, its branches reaching upward like hands in prayer. Ben dismounted and helped Rachel down. They stood together looking at the tree that had sheltered 3 dying children just 2 months ago. "I want to do something," Rachel said suddenly. "Something to remember." "What did you have to remember?" Ben asked gently. "You're here. You're safe. That's real, not a memory." Rachel shook her head. "Not to remember the bad parts. To remember that bad things can turn into good things. That the worst moment of my life led to the best thing that ever happened to us." She walked forward and placed her hand on the rough bark. "This tree saved us. I want to honor it somehow." Ben considered this. Then he smiled. "What if we planted a new tree right here next to this one? A tree that will grow as you grow. In 20 years, when you're a woman with a life of your own. This tree will be tall and strong. A reminder that you survived and you thrived." Rachel's face lit up. "Can we do that? Can we plant a tree?" Ben nodded. "We'll wait until spring when the ground softens. We'll plant it together, all 5 of us. And we'll come back every year to see how it's grown." Rachel threw her arms around him. "Thank you, Papa. Thank you for understanding." As they rode back toward the ranch, Ben felt a peace he hadn't known in decades. The guilt he had carried since David's death, the grief that had hollowed him out for so many years, it was finally beginning to heal. Not because it had disappeared, but because he had found a way to transform it into something beautiful. March brought the first signs of spring. Snow melted into rushing streams. Green shoots pushed up through the wet earth. And the Crawford family began preparing for their tree planting ceremony. Ben rode into town and consulted with Hiram Morrison, the farmer who had testified on Rachel's behalf. Morrison suggested a blue spruce hardy and long-lived perfect for the harsh Wyoming climate. He helped Ben select a young sapling and gave him detailed instructions on how to plant it properly. On the first Saturday of April, when the ground had finally thawed enough to dig, the Crawford family dressed in their work clothes and rode out to the cottonwood tree. Ben carried the sapling carefully wrapped in burlap. Maggie brought a jug of water and a Bible. The girls each carried shovels appropriate to their size. The morning was clear and bright with a gentle breeze that smelled of wet earth and new growth. Birds sang in the budding trees. The cottonwood itself seemed to welcome them, its branches just beginning to show the first hints of green. Ben marked out a spot about 10 feet from the cottonwood, close enough to be connected, but far enough that the roots wouldn't compete. Then he handed Rachel the first shovel. "You start," he said. "This is your tree as much as anyone's." Rachel dug the first shovelful of earth, her face serious with the weight of the moment. Then Emma took a turn, then Rose, then Maggie, then Ben. They worked together, taking turns until they had a hole deep enough for the sapling's roots. Ben carefully unwrapped the young tree and positioned it in the hole. The girls held it steady while he and Maggie filled in the earth around it, packing it firm. When the tree was secure, Maggie poured water around its base, soaking the soil thoroughly. Then they all stood back to look at their work. The blue spruce looked small and fragile next to the towering cottonwood, but Ben knew that with time and care it would grow into something magnificent. Maggie opened the Bible and read aloud. "Therefore, if any man be in Christ, he is a new creature. Old things are passed away. Behold, all things are become new." She closed the book and looked at her family. "This tree represents our new beginning. It will grow strong because it's rooted in love, just like us." Rachel stepped forward and placed her hand on the young tree's trunk. "I promise to come back every year," she said solemnly, "to see how you're growing, and to remember that even the worst storms can lead to the most beautiful things." Emma and Rose added their hands to the tree, making the same promise. Then Ben and Maggie joined them, all 5 hands touching the small tree in a circle. Ben felt tears burning in his eyes. He thought of David Patterson, the friend who had died in his place. He thought of Sarah and their son lost to disease. He thought of all the years of loneliness and guilt and grief. And then he looked at his daughters, at his wife, at this family that had been forged from tragedy and hardship. He thought of Judge Patricia Holloway, who had also been saved by the Patterson family all those years ago. He realized that David's parents, in adopting Patricia, had set in motion a chain of events that would lead to this moment decades later. The Pattersons had saved Patricia. Patricia had saved Rachel, Emma, and Rose, and in saving them, she had saved Ben as well. It was a legacy of rescue stretching across generations. And now Ben had the chance to continue it, to pass it forward to these 3 girls who would grow up knowing they were chosen, cherished, loved. "We should make this an annual tradition," Maggie said, breaking the reverent silence. "Every April we come here together. We measure the tree's growth and we celebrate how far we've come as a family." The girls agreed enthusiastically. They spent another hour at the site, exploring the area that had once been a place of death and had now become a place of life and memory. Rose found wildflowers beginning to bloom and picked a small bouquet. Emma sketched the cottonwood and the young spruce in her notebook. Rachel simply sat at the base of the cottonwood, running her fingers over the bark, lost in thought. On the ride home, Ben found himself thinking about the future instead of the past. For so many years he had been looking backward, trapped in memories and regrets. But now, with his family around him, the future stretched ahead, bright with possibility. As spring deepened into summer, life on the Crawford Ranch flourished. Ben taught the girls to ride properly. Rachel proved to be a natural horsewoman, fearless and skilled. Emma preferred the gentler horses, content to plod along at a peaceful pace. Rose, despite her small size, declared herself Thunder's best friend and spent hours grooming the big horse and feeding him apples. Maggie's garden exploded with growth. She taught the girls to plant seeds, pull weeds, harvest vegetables at just the right time. The kitchen smelled constantly of fresh bred herbs and whatever seasonal produce they were preserving for winter. On warm evenings, the family sat on the porch and watched the sun set over the prairie. Ben would tell stories of his childhood in Virginia before the war changed everything. Maggie shared tales of her grandparents' journey from Ireland, the hardships they faced and overcame. And gradually, carefully, the girls began to share their own memories of their parents. Emma remembered how Mama used to sing while she worked, her voice clear and sweet. Rose didn't remember much, but she knew Papa had called her his little rosebud. And Rachel shared the weight she had carried, the burden of being the oldest, the one who had to keep everyone together. "You don't have to be the strong one all the time anymore," Ben told her gently. "That's what parents are for. Let me and your Mama carry some of that weight." Rachel nodded, but old habits died hard. She still woke sometimes in the night and checked on her sisters. She still felt responsible for their happiness and safety. But slowly, week by week, she was learning to let go, learning to trust that the adults in her life would keep their promises. In August, the Crawford family attended the county fair in Cheyenne. It was a 3-day journey by wagon, and they camped along the way, cooking over open fires and sleeping under the stars. For the girls who had never been anywhere beyond Pine Ridge and the ranch, it was an adventure beyond imagining. The fair itself was overwhelming in the best possible way. There were agricultural displays, livestock competitions, games, and contests. Maggie entered her preserves in the canning competition and won a blue ribbon. Emma's drawings were displayed in the children's art show, and Rachel, after much encouragement, entered the horse riding competition for girls under 14. Ben stood at the fence and watched his 12-year-old daughter guide her horse through the course with skill and confidence. She jumped obstacles, demonstrated control, and finished with a time good enough for 3rd place. When she accepted her ribbon, her smile was so bright it could have lit the night sky. That evening, as they sat around their campfire on the outskirts of Cheyenne, Ben looked at his family and felt a contentment so profound it was almost painful. These were the moments he had thought lost to him forever. Ordinary moments, simple joys, a family being together. Maggie leaned against his shoulder. "Happy?" she asked quietly. "More than I thought possible," he replied. She took his hand and squeezed it. "Me too." September brought the return to school. Rachel was now in the advanced class learning algebra and literature. Emma had overcome her shyness enough to make friends with 2 other girls her age. Even Rose, starting her first full year of school, marched into the one-room schoolhouse with confidence. Mrs. Morrison pulled Ben aside during one of his visits to pick up the girls. "Rachel is exceptional," she said without preamble. "I've taught for 20 years and I've rarely seen a mind like hers. She understands complex concepts the first time they're explained. Her writing is sophisticated beyond her years. Have you considered sending her to a proper academy when she's older?" Ben was taken aback. "An academy? I don't know. That would mean sending her away." Morrison nodded. "Not for several years yet. But when she's 15 or 16, there are schools in Denver, even back east, that could give her opportunities she'll never have here. She could become a teacher herself, or a writer, or anything she wants to be." The thought of Rachel leaving even years in the future made Ben's chest tight, but he also knew he couldn't hold her back out of his own need to keep her close. "I'll talk to her about it," he said finally. "When the time comes, it will be her choice." Morrison smiled. "That's the mark of a good parent, Mr. Crawford, knowing when to hold on and when to let go." That evening, Ben mentioned the conversation to Maggie as they prepared dinner. "She's only 12, Maggie said practically. "We have years before we need to make any decisions. But Morrison is right. Rachel is brilliant. We should encourage her to dream as big as she wants." Ben nodded, but his heart was heavy. He had only just found his daughter. The thought of eventually losing her to her own bright future was bittersweet. As if sensing his thoughts, Maggie touched his cheek gently. "You're not losing her, Ben. You're giving her wings. There's a difference." October brought the first hard frost. The cottonwood and the young blue spruce stood together in the changing season, one preparing for dormancy, the other still growing steadily. The Crawford family rode out to visit them on a Sunday afternoon, bringing a picnic lunch. Rachel measured the spruce with a piece of string. It had grown 6 inches since they planted it in April. She tied a ribbon around the trunk at the new height mark, creating a record of its growth. By next year, it will be taller than Rose Emma predicted. Rose, now 5 years old and proud of every inch of her height, put her hands on her hips. "I'm growing too," she declared. "We'll see who's taller." They all laughed. It was these moments, light and easy, that Ben treasured most. The simple normalcy of family life. No trauma, no crisis, just the gentle rhythms of days passing one into another. As November arrived and the weather turned cold, preparations began for the family's first Thanksgiving together. Maggie started planning the menu weeks in advance. The girls helped with preparations, learning to make pie crusts and stuff poultry. Pastor Helen and Sheriff Miller were invited to share the meal along with Thomas Webb and his wife Catherine, who had become good friends with Maggie. The small ranch house was filled to capacity, but no one minded the crowding. Before the meal, Ben asked everyone to share something they were grateful for. Sheriff Miller spoke of his continued good health and the privilege of serving a community he loved. Pastor Helen gave thanks for the way the Crawford family had strengthened the bonds of their small town, reminding everyone what it meant to choose love over convenience. Webb looked at Ben directly. "I'm grateful that Ben Crawford pulled me out from under that wagon at Appomattox 24 years ago. Everything good in my life has flowed from that moment, and I'm grateful I could help repay that debt by helping him build his family." Catherine Webb smiled at the girls. "I'm grateful for the reminder that family comes in many forms. My husband and I couldn't have children of our own, and I had made peace with that. But watching this family form, seeing how love can create bonds stronger than blood, it's healed something in me I didn't know needed healing." When it came to Maggie's turn, her eyes were bright with tears. "I'm grateful for second chances," she said simply. "I thought my chance at motherhood died with my son, but these 3 girls have taught me that love doesn't run out. There's always room for more." The girls spoke next. Rose was grateful for her papa's horses and mama's cookies. Emma was grateful for her new friends at school and for not being afraid anymore. Rachel's answer was the longest. "I'm grateful we ran into that storm." She said, her voice steady. "I know that sounds strange, but if we hadn't run, if we hadn't nearly died, we never would have found Papa. We never would have become a family. So I'm grateful for the hard things that led to the beautiful things." She looked at Ben. "And I'm grateful that Papa found us, that he didn't ride past that tree, that he cared enough to save 3 children he didn't know. Because of him, I got to keep my promise to Mama. I got to keep my sisters safe, and I got a father and mother who love us." When it was Ben's turn, he found his throat too tight to speak for a moment. He looked around the table at these people who had become his family, his community, his purpose. Finally, he managed to speak. 25 years ago, I came home from the war to find everyone I loved dead. I thought my life was over. I thought I had nothing left to live for. I spent years just existing, going through the motions, waiting to die." He looked at his daughters. "And then one night in the middle of the worst blizzard in 20 years, I heard 3 children crying in the snow. And suddenly I had a reason to live again. These 3 girls gave me back my life. So I'm grateful for them, for their courage, their resilience, their capacity to love despite everything they've been through." He turned to Maggie. "And I'm grateful for my wife who had every reason to stay closed off and safe, but chose to open her heart instead, who chose to love not just the girls but me, who made me remember what it feels like to be part of something bigger than myself." He raised his glass. "To family, found chosen and cherished." Everyone echoed the toast and the meal began. It was loud and chaotic and perfect, exactly what Ben had imagined a family gathering should be. That night, after everyone had left and the girls were asleep, Ben and Maggie stood on the porch looking up at the November stars. "This time last year I was alone," Ben said quietly. "It was just me and the horses and the empty rooms. I thought that's how I would die. Alone." Maggie took his hand. "You're not alone anymore. You'll never be alone again." Ben pulled her close. "I love you, Maggie Crawford. I need you to know that. Not just appreciate you or care about you. I love you." Maggie looked up at him with shining eyes. "I've been waiting to hear you say that." "I know. I'm sorry it took so long." She smiled and kissed him. "Some things are worth waiting for." December arrived with its promise of Christmas and celebration. The Crawford family threw themselves into preparations with enthusiasm. They cut down a pine tree from the back pasture and hauled it into the house, decorating it with ornaments Maggie and the girls made from scraps of fabric and paper. The house smelled of cinnamon and pine and fresh-baked cookies. On Christmas Eve, snow began to fall, gently coating the world in fresh white. The family gathered by the fire for their traditional evening of stories and songs. Ben read the Christmas story from the Bible while the girls listened, their faces glowing in the firelight. Then came the exchange of gifts. For Rose, Ben had carved a small wooden horse painted to look like thunder. Her squeal of delight filled the house. For Emma, Maggie had sewn a special book bag filled with drawing pencils and quality paper. Emma hugged it to her chest like treasure. Rose looked at the wooden horse, then at Ben, her eyes shining with wonder and love. She climbed into his lap, the little horse clutched in one hand. "Papa," she whispered, testing the word. "Can I call you Papa now? Really, truly?" Ben's throat closed up. He had been Mr. Crawford, then Mr. Ben, but never Papa. Not out loud, not like this. "Yes, sweetheart," he managed. "I would love that more than anything." Rose threw her arms around his neck. "I love you, Papa." And Ben, this man who had fought in wars and survived blizzards and buried everyone he loved, wept openly for the second time in his life. The first had been when he lost his family. This time he cried because he had found one. For Rachel, there was a beautiful leather-bound journal with her name embossed on the cover in gold letters. But there was also something else, a small box wrapped in delicate paper. Rachel opened it carefully and gasped. Inside was a delicate gold necklace with a small pendant engraved with a single word, "Daughter." Tears spilled down her cheeks as Ben helped her fasten it around her neck. "You are my daughter," he said quietly, "today and always. I wanted you to have something you could wear close to your heart, something to remind you that you belong here. You belong to us." Rachel threw her arms around him and sobbed into his shoulder, all the fear and uncertainty of the past year finally released in those tears. She had been so brave for so long, so strong. Now she could finally be vulnerable, finally be a child, because she knew she was safe. The girls gave their parents gifts too. They had pooled their meager coins and bought Maggie a set of beautiful hair combs. For Ben, they had something different. Rachel had drawn a picture of the whole family standing in front of the ranch house, the cottonwood tree visible in the background. It was detailed and loving, every face carefully rendered. "Mama taught me how to make it look real," Rachel explained. "And Emma helped with the colors." And Rose picked the frame. Ben stared at the drawing, at this representation of the family he thought he would never have. He hung it above the fireplace that very night, where he could see it every day. On Christmas morning they attended church service where Pastor Helen spoke about the gift of family, of how the Holy Family itself had been formed through unexpected circumstances and divine providence. She looked directly at the Crawfords as she spoke, and Ben felt the full weight of how blessed they were. After church they rode out to visit the cottonwood tree and the young spruce. The trees stood peaceful in the snow, the spruce still green and vital despite the winter cold. "This tree is strong," Rachel observed, touching the spruce's needles. "It's not afraid of winter." "Neither are we," Ben said. "We've survived our winter. Now we're growing toward spring." As they stood there together, a family united by choice and love rather than blood, Ben thought about the journey that had brought them here. The war, the losses, the years of isolation, the blizzard that brought 3 dying children to his door, the legal battle that could have torn them apart, and finally the judge who understood that family was about love, not paperwork. He thought about David Patterson, the friend who had died in his place, and David's parents who had saved Patricia Holloway, just as Ben had saved Rachel, Emma, and Rose. He thought about the chain of compassion stretching across decades, each act of kindness rippling forward in time. And he understood that this was his redemption. Not forgetting the past, but transforming it. Not erasing the pain, but using it to create something beautiful. The years that followed were good ones. Rachel grew into a brilliant young woman, eventually accepting a scholarship to a teaching college in Denver. But she came home every summer and Christmas bringing stories of her education and her dreams. She became a teacher, as Mrs. Morrison had predicted, but she returned to Wyoming to teach, wanting to give other children the opportunities she had been given. Emma's talent for art blossomed. She studied with a painter in Cheyenne and became known throughout the territory for her landscapes. Her paintings of the cottonwood tree and the blue spruce hung in galleries and homes across Wyoming. Rose fulfilled her childhood dream and became a veterinarian, one of the first women in the territory to do so. She took over the medical care of all the animals on the ranch and eventually opened a practice in Pine Ridge. Ben and Maggie grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year. They celebrated 20 anniversaries watching their daughters grow and thrive. They became grandparents when Rachel married a schoolteacher named William and had 3 children of her own. And every April without fail, the family gathered at the cottonwood tree to measure the growth of the blue spruce and celebrate how far they had come. 10 years after that first Christmas together, on a warm summer day in 1899, the entire Crawford family gathered at the site. Rachel was there with her husband William and their 2 children. Emma had brought her fiancé, a rancher's son from the next county. Rose, now 15 and full of dreams about veterinary school, was there with her ever-present bag of medical supplies for treating any animal in need. The blue spruce had grown tall and strong, nearly 15 feet high now. Its branches were thick and healthy, providing shade beneath its canopy. The cottonwood still towered above it, but the spruce was finding its own place in the landscape. Ben, now 61 and grayer but still strong, stood with Maggie, now 53 and still beautiful, under the trees they had planted together. Rachel approached them with her children, a boy of 5 and a girl of 3. The little girl looked remarkably like Rachel had at that age. "Grandpa," Rachel said, "I want to tell them the story about the night you found us." Ben knelt down so he was eye level with his grandchildren. 10 years ago, he began, his voice still strong and clear. There was a terrible blizzard, the worst storm anyone had seen in 20 years. And in that storm, 3 little girls were lost and freezing. They huddled under that big cottonwood tree, trying to stay warm, thinking they might die. The children's eyes went wide. "But their papa found them," Rachel said, continuing the story. "He came through the snow like a miracle. He wrapped them in his coat and took them home and saved their lives. And then he did something even more important. He made them his daughters. He chose them. He loved them. And he gave them a family." The little boy looked up at Ben with awe. "Was Mama one of the little girls?" "Yes," Ben said softly. "Your Mama was the brave one. She protected her sisters. She was the strongest person I ever knew." Rachel hugged her father tight. "You saved us, Papa. You saved all of us." Ben looked around at his family, at the daughters who had grown into remarkable women, at the grandchildren who would carry the legacy forward, at Maggie, his partner and love, at this tree they had planted together as a symbol of new growth and second chances. "You saved me too," he said. "All of you. I was a lonely old man waiting to die. You gave me a reason to live." They spent the afternoon under the trees, eating a picnic lunch and telling stories. The children played. The adults reminisced. And as the sun began to set over the Wyoming prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, the family stood together in a circle around the blue spruce. "This tree is strong because it's rooted in love," Maggie said, repeating the words she had spoken 10 years ago. "Just like us," Emma added her own thought. "And it will keep growing long after we're gone. Someday someone will stand under this tree and wonder about the people who planted it. And maybe they'll feel the love we put into this ground." Rose, ever practical, smiled. "Or maybe they'll just think it's a nice tree and never know the story. But we'll know, and that's enough." Ben pulled his family close. "This tree is our legacy. Not the only one, but an important one. It says that we were here, that we loved each other, that we survived and thrived and chose to mark that survival with life instead of bitterness." He looked at Rachel. "Your mama, your first mama, made you promise to keep your sisters safe, and you did. You kept that promise even when it nearly killed you. And now look at what's grown from that promise. Not just you 3, but all of us. A whole family tree rooted in courage and love." As the last light faded from the sky, they made their way back to the wagons. But Ben lingered for a moment, one hand on the cottonwood, the other on the spruce. "Thank you," he whispered to the trees, to the universe, to whatever power had guided 3 dying children to this spot on a winter night 10 years ago. "Thank you for giving me this life, this family, this love." The wind whispered through the branches, and for a moment Ben could have sworn he heard David Patterson's voice carried on that breeze. "Well done, old friend. Well done." Ben climbed into the wagon where Maggie waited. She took his hand and smiled, understanding without words what he was feeling. as they drove away from the trees toward the ranch house lit with warm lamplight. In the distance, Ben looked back one more time. The cottonwood and the spruce stood together in the twilight, two trees that had saved lives and witnessed the birth of a family. Some rescues save lives, Ben thought. Others save souls. And the rarest rescues do both. He had been rescued that night 10 years ago, just as surely as Rachel, Emma, and Rose had been. Rescued from loneliness and guilt and the slow death of living without purpose. 3 children crying in a blizzard had given him back his life, his heart, his reason for being, and in return he had given them a home. Not just a house, but a place where they belonged, where they were chosen, where they were loved. That was the true miracle of the cottonwood tree. Not just that it had sheltered 3 children from death, but that it had brought together 5 broken people and made them whole. As the wagon rolled toward home, Ben Crawford looked at his family and felt peace settle over him like a benediction. The war was over. The grief was healed. The guilt was forgiven. And in a small ranch house in Wyoming, 5 people who had chosen each other out of all the world sat down to dinner together. They laughed. They talked. They made plans for tomorrow, and next week, and next year. They were a family, not because of blood or law or obligation, but because of something far more powerful. They were a family because of love, and that Ben Crawford knew was the greatest gift anyone could ever receive.